So I was trying to make a video about 9/11 conspiracy theories and wound up making a video about pirates. Let me explain. Leading up to 2000, Afghanistan was producing about 70% of the world's opium supply. When the Taliban took over in the year 2000, they burned all the fields and cut production by over 90%. Did you know that the war plans for the war in Afghanistan were actually drawn up before September 11th, 2001? NBC article, mainstream news. We went from 74 tons per year up to 6,100 tons in just 5 years of occupation. I think we're gonna need to go back and study the history of opium a little bit. And it's gonna lead us to pirates. We're also gonna meet the first global mega corporation, meet the first global drug cartels, to the first global banking cartels, meet the first private armies and privatized military industrial complex, and we'll even learn a thing or two about the history of human trafficking. Oh, and did I mention that this is where stock markets came from? Yeah, this episode is about to be packed. And we're running out of time, so let's roll that intro and get this show on the road.
American conspiracy theories are dangerous.
Information is the oxygen of a democracy.
With Republicans, with progressives, with libertarians, because this is not about right and left, this is about right and wrong.
It's so sick we can't talk about it. It actually lifted up, and it could actually turn.
It started here when I was trying to get the official story on what really happened on September 11th, and I noticed that there were 19 men who hijacked planes. They were from 4 countries, but none of those countries were Afghanistan. They were from Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. So how do we go to Afghanistan because of that? Well, you probably already know that the answer is the Taliban. And a quick note about Wikipedia. We know that it's not necessarily a 100% accurate source on all things. I mean, the CIA was actually caught red-handed editing Wikipedia pages about the Iraq War back in 2003. Weird. But all the information we're going to go over today is sourced from other sources. It is pretty easily verifiable. And the whole point is that I don't want this video to get taken down. I'm only going mainstream narrative, very basic sources, very basic information. You don't have to dig super deep to realize that there's actually something pretty fucked up going on here. In the future, we're definitely going to dig a little deeper and go into more other sources that get deeper into other rabbit holes, but in this video, you don't really need to, because this is all really basic history, and it's not that controversial. You just need to look at it all from the right lens. Because in history class, a lot of us were taught a lot of things about what happened in the world, but the narrative was never structured around how global banking and global military power and global drug cartels all sort of work together to tie this world up into a nice little bow. And all you need to do is look at the same history that we all learned, but through a different lens, and it all becomes pretty clear what's going on today. And we're just gonna skip over this part for a minute, and we're gonna skip over the part where the CIA funded and trained the Afghan Mujahideen back in the Cold War, where at the height of Operation Cyclone, we were given over $500 million a year to terrorist organizations in Afghanistan to fight the communists. And we're also gonna skip the fact that the founders of the Taliban were all members of the Mujahideen. That's weird. We're gonna skip all that, because there's actually a better place to start that's even wilder. If you were here with us last week, you remember this graph that showed that opioid prescriptions just happened to skyrocket right when we invaded Afghanistan. And did you know that Afghanistan is the #1 producer of opium in the world and has been for quite some time? Actually, coincidentally, this all started in Afghanistan back in the Cold War when we backed a hostile takeover of the government. Weird. But anyways, on to more recent history. Leading up to 2000, Afghanistan was producing about 70% of the world's opium supply. But then, when the Taliban took over in the year 2000, you know, just before the terrorist attacks and the war in Afghanistan, they actually are religiously opposed to opium, and they burned all the fields and cut production by over 90%, down to just 74 metric tons per year. Did you know that the war plans for the war in Afghanistan were actually drawn up before September 11th, 2001? This is an NBC article, mainstream news. And so after the Taliban burned all the opium fields and illegalized its production, he just went in there and invaded. 1 year later, Afghanistan was back to being the world's #1 supplier of opium. In just 1 year, we went from 74 tons per year to 1,278 tons in 2002. Production doubled again the next year to 4,200 metric tons. That was 76% of the global supply and 60% of Afghanistan's GDP. In 2006, the production in Afghanistan was up to 6,100 tons of opium, equaling 82% of the world's supply. We went from 74 tons per year under Taliban rule up to 6,100 tons in just 5 years of occupation. Once again, we went from just 74 metric tons produced per year in the year 2000 to over 6,000 tons per year. And let's be clear, the Taliban is reprehensible. I'm not advocating that the Taliban are the good guys. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not making any definitive claims. All I'm saying is that happened, and then that happened. And history is pretty complex, and power gets pretty dark pretty fast. So it seems to me that if we want to understand what really happened in Afghanistan, thereby what happened on 9/11, and thereby what happened in the whole war on terror ever since, I think we're going to need to go back and study the history of opium a little bit, because it's pretty telling. Real quick, y'all see my boat? I got a boat. Ain't she purty? La Frigata Española from 1780. Genuine. Anyways, put her back in her place without knocking everything over. Okay, so I want to invite you during this journey to draw your own connections between history and modern times. Because there's a lot of things that I'm not going to say out loud, so that hopefully these videos stay up. There's a lot more digging to be done. This is just starting points. The rabbit hole goes deep. Feel free to do your own research. Just be careful, think critically, draw your own conclusions, and realize that not all conspiracy theories are true. Not all evidence is valid. Take everything with big heaps of salt. But history is quite instructive, and you're going to notice a lot of parallels between the 1500s and the 2000s. For most of the history of civilization, we were a land-based people, for the most part. Our empires were based on land, our armies traveled by foot, our trade traveled overland via routes like the Silk Road as it was established, and everything took a long time. There was obviously seafaring, but it was limited to, port to port across small bodies of water. It developed mostly in island zones like in Indonesia, the East Indies, or over in the Mediterranean, the North Sea. We're talking about this part of history where we had people like Alexander the Great conquering, a bunch of Europe and Egypt and stuff like that. Talking about this part of history where Rome came to power and ruled vast empires for hundreds of years. There was tons of important stuff going on all over the world, but obviously because we're trying to track the history of Western global superpowers in the modern day, we're naturally tracking Western history back to where those powers originated. So Eurocentrism is based into this research because we're trying to find the origins of said Eurocentric power sources. Capiche? And eventually, shipbuilding technology advanced to a point where ships were starting to be able to travel very long distances across wide open water. And people started to look out at the ocean. But the logical first step was not to cross across the ocean, but instead to follow land around the bottom of Africa over to the East Indies, where European powers already knew of civilizations because they had been trading across the Silk Road with these peoples for a vast amount of time, and they had maps. And when they finally learned how to sail around Africa and how to have maritime trade with these locations, everything sped up very quickly. Turns out the company's first voyage was led by a man named James Lancaster, who sailed aboard the Red Dragon. No shit, George R.R. Martin. I bet that guy paid his debts. He went on to be one of the founding members of the East India Trading Company, which we'll get to in a minute. And at about this time, explorers started traveling outwards from Europe all across the seas, traversing the entire globe and mapping other continents that they had never been to. Everything was changing very quickly. Side note, this map's pretty neat if you want to pause and zoom in and look at what's going on here. It's kind of cool to look at these different explorers. They've got dates and names. And obviously, some of this is vague and probably not totally correct, and they're missing some of the Vikings that probably came across earlier. I mean, calm down, calm down. And a lot of this early exploration was done by what were called privateers, which were basically government-sanctioned pirates. Privateers carried what was called a letter of marque, which was issued by a royalty, a government, a sovereign. Letters of marque were popularized during the Middle Ages and were in use all the way through the American Revolution up to, the late 1800s. Being a privateer was seen as a noble calling, exploring and fighting on the seas for country and religion and the betterment of the people. But being a pirate was reviled and evil and unjust. The difference was pretty subjective and often just a matter of interpretation. Depending on which ship you attacked, you were either a pirate or a gentleman. It was a wild time. And everyone was just so pretty. It's worth noting that letters of marque were used by governments to fight proxy wars without actually declaring war and engaging their formal military strength. This quote's pure gold. In orange here. According to Groitus, letters of marque were akin to a private war, a concept foreign to modern sensibilities, because we don't have that anymore. Surely we don't have private corporations causing and profiteering off of war in modern times. That would be unconscionable. And through the 1500s and 1600s, as these explorers traveled the globe, tensions rose between Spain, France, Portugal, Great Britain, who were the major superpowers in this exploration. And they all wanted control of the global economy. It culminated in what was really the First World War, called the 7 Years' War, and it was waged in theaters from Europe to North America, all the way over to East Asia. Back when this all started, these cultures were pretty advanced and wanted to buy a bunch of stuff. A bunch of cultures in here were pretty advanced and wanted to buy a bunch of stuff. A bunch of cultures over here were pretty advanced and wanted to buy a bunch of stuff. These dudes were just doing their thing and wanted to be left alone. But over here there was lots of resources, and over here there was lots of resources that all these guys wanted to trade. So the war naturally took place for control over these resources and control over this trade. Turns out the Cold War is nothing new. All the way back in 1324, we were making agreements not to use privateers to attack each other. And then, the same nation subsequently engaged in privateering for the next several hundred years against one another, culminating in an all-out war for global domination. And as Great Britain started to access the global trade networks across into the East Indies, which means like the Philippines, Southeast Asia, a whole bunch of rich guys, including James Lancaster, petitioned the Queen for exclusive trading rights over in the East Indies. Power's gonna power, and so they consolidated that power and got a monopoly. A formalized legal monopoly on all trade with this entire sector of the world. At its peak, the East India Trading Company was the largest corporation in the world. They accounted for half of global trade, and they had a military twice the size of England's formal military. They were involved in the slave trade, i.e. human trafficking. Saltpeter, used for gunpowder, was also one of their major trading goods and was so valuable and important that it allowed them to get away with a lot of illegal things just because governments needed the saltpeter. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. One of their most profitable exports was opium. And the biggest market for opium was in China, because China didn't want anything else that they had to trade except for their silver and their opium. And you can't grow silver. Opium became such a problem in China that in the 1700s they started to ban it, and by the 1800s they were trying to all out eradicate the use of it. But you can't cut into them profits. So the East India Company started offloading it in Calcutta to private businesses with the understanding that then they would smuggle it in to China. And thus we have the beginnings of the first global illegal drug trade. And let's remember, it's linked to a gigantic private military, gigantic private finance that's globalized, the human trafficking trade, slavery. All of these industries go hand in hand. They've been privatized and organized from the start. Culture. Some culture. In the 1800s, the US even started to get in on this profit. Despite drastic penalties and continued prohibition of opium until 1860, opium smuggling only increased. From 200 chests under this dude, to 1,000 chests under this dude, to 4,000 chests under this dude, to 30,000 chests under this emperor. Yes, that's an increase from 200 chests per year to 30,000 chests per year. Where was it that I heard numbers like that before? Something sounds familiar. In purple here. The illegal trade of opium became one of the world's most valuable single commodity trades and has been called the most long-continued and systemic international crime of modern times. Opium smuggling provided 15 to 20% of the British Empire's revenue. Down here at the bottom, you can see that the Qing Emperor was so pissed off about all this opium destroying his country that he outlawed it and destroyed a whole bunch of opium. And the Queen of England got pissed, and she started a war about it. In fact, there were 2 wars about it. The first one was Britain versus China being like, yo, you can't outlaw our illegal drug smuggling into your country. And by the time we had the second opium war, France wanted to get in on that action too. So it was Britain and France against China. China lost. And not only were they forced to legalize opium again, they were also forced to pay reparations for the opium they had destroyed and to allow British traders into the country to continue selling it to their people. Man, it's a good thing that history does not repeat itself. Real quick, I thought this was pretty cool. This is a print from 1850 showing what an opium warehouse looked like, where they would take the sap and roll it up into balls and dry it in clay pots stacked in these gigantic towers. Look at this crap. And they would use totally chill workers that weren't slaves to, process all this opium and sell it. This kind of thing totally is not happening today. Absolutely wouldn't be sanctioned by public companies, governments, military, tax dollars. And it's worth taking a moment to think about why opium, as opposed to all the other drugs that are in circulation today. And the answer is that opium has always been the most profitable one, because most of the drugs in circulation today are actually synthetic and are much newer and didn't exist for most of human history, like pills and cocaine, and all of those drugs are chemical extractions and things that were invented later on. But the ancient drugs, tobacco, alcohol, and opium, I guess cannabis too, out of those 4, opium is the most addictive, the most profitable, and the most impactful on culture. Well, alcohol might give it a strong run for its money, but you can't control alcohol production as much because you can just leave some fruit out to rot and then you've got alcohol. But opium production is easy to control, very profitable, also very medically useful. Over the years, opium was slowly replaced by more purified extractions and compounds related to opium. First was morphine, and by now we have all different kinds of synthetic opioids on the market, mostly produced by corporations. And that brings us back to modern times, when opium cultivation is still one of the most important crops to the international drug cartels. And when you look at the 2 places in the world where almost all of the opium is grown, what do you notice about those 2 places? Weird. We spent a long time hanging out over there, and then we spent a long time hanging out over there. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Nothing to see there. So I know I teased you about getting to this part, but you're gonna have to wait till next week because this video is already getting really long and this is a whole other can of worms to open up. But if you realize what we've just done, we've just summarized a very important shift in history. Before about here, Roman Empire, that was the age of foot, when armies and empires were all based upon land movements and small naval movements. Technology had not yet advanced in order to globalize in a way that ships allowed for. This area here is where ship technology started to expand, and this purple line right here is about where the age of exploration took off and empires began to globalize. And it wasn't until about here in very modern times when the Industrial Revolution brought about planes and trains and motorized vehicles, which completely changed the game. And so we've now learned about how globalization began the age of international banking, international drug cartels, international human trafficking, global military industrial complexes. Next week, we'll look at how the Industrial Revolution changed the game and the nature of intelligence, the nature of drug trafficking, the nature of military force, the nature of controlling the narrative all had to shift with it as technology advanced. I want to finish off with a reminder that I don't know what I'm talking about, and that was all made up, and you should do your own research and take everything with a grain of salt. History is written by the victors, and it's pretty complex. If you're a fan of following the money and a fan of what we're doing here, taking a nonpartisan look at who's really running the world, it would mean a lot if you would like this video, leave a meaningful comment, and subscribe to this channel. Because I'm trying to spread this message to everyone. I'm trying to change the conversation from left versus right bickering and change it to a real examination of the wealth and power that's ruling this world. And as you can see, it's been ruling this world for quite some time. And though the names may have changed, the game is still exactly the same. We have a very important election cycle coming up. We have a congressional hearing about aliens and UFOs next month. Digital currencies are about to be implemented on a global scale. There's a lot going on in the world right now. We need the conversation to be a unified, nonpartisan, rational debate. So I appreciate you all so much. We're gonna have a dance party down in the comments. We've been eating a lot of cake and cookies lately, so we'll be dropping veggies down below. Comment and I'll give you a veggie. Anyone got any favorite vegetables? We're not gonna give out any eggplants though, that would be pretty sus. Anyways, that's all for me for this week. I really appreciate you all being here. I'll see y'all next Sunday. Let's roll that outro.
American conspiracy theories are dangerous.
Information is the oxygen of a democracy.
With Republicans, with progressives, with libertarians, because this is not about right and left, this is about right and wrong.
It's so sacred we can't talk about it. It actually lifted up, and it could actually turn.
I'm gonna ask you to look away.
Legend has it that Christian Rosenkreuz drew his secret knowledge from the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians.
They estimated 100 yards from the left wing was this 100-foot disc.
You begin to get into this very scary scenario that has to do with the human condition of the proclivity to accumulate vast amounts of power around a handful of people. And right now, these misanthropic sociopaths are running the planet into the ground.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
There's so much evidence out there that even if less than 1% is true, that would be enough to collapse the current paradigm and change the whole planet. Our security is at stake.